All right, good evening. Welcome. My name is Pat Cawiezell, and I'm the buyer and author program coordinator at Magic City Books in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I want to thank you for taking a little bit of time on your Tuesday evening to be with us for the next in our continuing series of virtual author programs. We've been doing these programs since mid-April of 2020, and so now we've done over 160 of these programs, many of which are available on our YouTube channel. So if you just search Magic City Books on YouTube, you'll be able to see all of our programs, lots of great conversations with authors over the last year plus. And we have a lot more still coming, but the time in which we're going to be doing in-person events is on the horizon. And so I know that a lot of people are excited and ready to get back to doing things in person, and some things have already begun. We do have some plans in place to be doing some in-person programming later this summer. We've got some details to iron out, but we do have a couple of events scheduled before Labor Day. And then hopefully in September, we'll be able to start doing a lot more in-person programming and get back to being all together and celebrating authors in that space and not just virtually. Today is kind of a special day for Magic City Books. This is the anniversary of our kickoff event that happened 5 years ago. It was a day about as hot as it is today in Tulsa, for anybody that was there. We welcomed Stephen King to Kane's Ballroom for an author program, and at that program we announced that we would be opening Magic City Books, and now here we are 5 years later. We have just a really nothing but appreciation for our audience, our new audience that has joined us in this last year as we've had to adjust and move to Zoom. And now we have folks coming to our programming from all over the country and even around the world from time to time. People check in on us and visit our programs that way. And so we've seen just a lot of changes to a lot of things that we never expected to see happen, not just in this year, but kind of ever since we started the business. But that's a little bit about what having a small business is. And that is, one of the big themes in tonight's book. We are really excited to be welcoming Melissa Scholes Young for her book, The Hive. And just a little backstory here. Melissa's friend, Kate, and neighbor, is somebody that I grew up with in Iowa. I grew up with her sister. We were the same age and living in Davenport, Iowa, and growing up there. And now Kate and Melissa happen to be neighbors, and Kate had introduced me to Melissa's book that was coming out later this summer, and we were able to kind of put this all together and do a virtual event and do something, that this is one of those events that is a lot more possible thanks to the technology and thanks to being able to do virtual events, because sometimes, unless there's a big budget for authors to tour and stuff, it can be hard for authors to be able to visit, areas outside of home for them or back home, wherever it may be. And so we're really excited to be able to have this conversation tonight with Melissa. She's a professor at American University. She's the author of the previous novel, Flood, and her new book, The Hive, just came out last week. We have a link to purchase The Hive in the chat, or if you're joining us over on Facebook, it's in the program notes. If you have a question tonight for Melissa, please post that in the Q&A. There's a space to be able to do that at the bottom of your screen. And thank you all for joining us. Now, Melissa, welcome to Magic City Books. Thank you for being here tonight.
I am so excited to be here. I am so happy to talk to a fellow Midwesterner, Pat, and that Kate, who's an incredible writer who I happen to get lucky and know in my own neighborhood and in the DC literary community to be here. And Oklahoma has a special place in my heart too. 15 years ago, I was in Oklahoma City. Very first published short story was picked up by New Plains Review. I don't know if you know them locally, and they invited me out. I had never written a short story. I was in an MFA program, and the editor, Diana Getch, put me on stage, and they created like a big poster, and it had my name on it. And I think it corrupted me. I was just plucked out of a slush pile for a short story, and it made me think I could do this. Yeah. So Oklahoma has a special, I know it's about an hour and a half from you all in Tulsa, but it feels like I'm coming home. It's good to be
Well, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you. So I just wanted to kind of get started with a little bit of your background. So you grew up in Missouri, but not where the most of the action of this book takes place. You grew up in Hannibal, and this book, The Hive, takes place down in Cape Girardeau, down in southeastern Missouri. Um,
Yeah.
do you have some experience with Cape Girardeau? Is that a place that factors in your past as well?
So I was born and raised in Hannibal, which of
Mhm.
course is Mark Twain's boyhood home as well. So my first novel traffics really in Hannibal and Mark Twain mythology. It was more of a retelling of Tom and Huck's famous friendship as female. Cape Girardeau, though, has always had a place in my heart too, because it's down by Cairo, Illinois, which is where I did my MFA in Carbondale in Southern Illinois. And Cairo is that spot, if you'll remember from Huckleberry Finn, where Jim and Huck miss the turnoff in the fog at night. And so I always wanted to set a book at that intersection, right? And really think about the ways that split second decisions and grief and those things happen in our lives and change our trajectory. So Cape Girardeau has a special place in my heart, but specifically because of the literature of Mark Twain as well.
Yeah, that's great. Um, so when discussing novels, we always want to make sure that we're not going to give away too much information. But luckily for us, the marketing people with the publishing companies give us some descriptions back, and so it's pretty safe to kind of cover anything that they're covering on the back matter of the book, or in the inside flap. And so one of the things that we know about this book is that it is just from picking it up and taking a look at the back, is that this is a family that it has a family business, the exterminating company, Fehler Family Exterminator, or I might have that wrong, but
No, you're right. You're absolutely right, Pat. The
yep,
Feller families, they have a pest control business called Feller
yes,
Family Exterminating. You're right.
yes, and 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 it's the family has four daughters, and so those are kind of our main characters, as well as their mom. And we know from before we start the book that the dad is not going to make it. I mean, he is going to pass away. And so I wanted to talk just a little bit about kind of the way that you set the book up with multiple narrators and having different sisters and the mother kind of narrating the different chapters of the book, and moving the story through more than one voice, and kind of why you felt like that was the best way for you to share this story, and why that's why this story needed to be told.
Right. So you're right. We have five different point of view characters, one from each of the Feller women, right? So Grace, the mother, and then the four sisters. And the Hive it's a story about class, right? In Middle America, and the fates of the four sisters and their family business in a politically divided town. I always knew that it was going to be the women of the novel speaking, and I always knew it was also going to be set in 2008, because I wanted to look at the recession in Middle America and that growing fear that they faced in their family business, but also in a politically divided town, that type of resentment that I was seeing during the recession, and this really blaming of Obama, which I think really laid the foundation for the election we had 8 years later. And Robbie, the patriarch, who you're right, they give it away on the back flap, so we can talk about it, Pat. He's the patriarch, and he's the most problematic character, I think, in the Hive, and he sort of longs for a past that has more to do with fear, right, and his own wrestling for power. And his sudden death makes, I think, room for the five women, for all five point of views to be more clear, and to watch each of them sort of be impacted by sudden grief and kind of grow from that grief. So I really wanted to explore within a year past his death how that would affect the family business, but also these women surviving together.
Well, and so reading it, although it's set in 2008, there is, I think that the fact that it came out in 2021, as we've all been living through this pandemic together, and so many of us have lost a loved one at some point, fairly recently. That just seems to be there are probably lucky few of us who have not, but there are a lot of loved ones that have gone in this last year. And so I felt like, those grief sentiments really kind of struck me, particularly as we were going through, just because, the experience that they have really has mirrored the times in my life where I've lost somebody that was important to me, where things can seem okay and then not okay, kind of with no real way of knowing that difference. And I remember someone telling me, that you're not going to have any control over it, and it just is going to happen, and you can't be too worried about it, and you can't be upset with yourself for when it doesn't happen either. And I think that all of the sisters and Grace, the mother, always kind of are all dealing with that in their own way, and you see them in their growth kind of throughout the rest of the book, handle it and also not handle it some, at times very well, and they all have kind of their own mechanisms. And anyway, I just thought that that writing those feelings and those the different ways in which it affected each of the characters was just really well done. So
I appreciate that, Pat. And I think it is a timely book. When I was writing it, I couldn't have imagined the pandemic, right? But I think that grief is always pretty fresh. And as you said, Pat, it's not static. It's something that we're going through, right? It's something that's always occurring. And that was a big challenge with writing The Hive, is figuring out how the grief affected each of the Fehler women differently, and watching when that grief kind of bubbled up and when it seemed manageable, but not expecting it to be done with a funeral, right? That's sometimes a funeral is a gift because you're busy, right? You know what to do. This is what you're supposed to do to honor and bury the dead. And then life comes back, and that's when the grief really begins, is when you're figuring out what to do next in the absence of this person. And there's also a retelling of their story, I think, when they're gone. And that happens with Robbie as well. There's a lot of surprises that happen after his death that affect the business, that affect the family. And so they are grieving, but they're also going through a range of emotions, right? They're angry. They're frustrated with what they found out. They're scared about their future. They are strong in the way that they bond together, but that grief is complicated. I very much wanted to write a portrait of a complicated type of grief and how it affects a whole family. So for when I chose the 5 point of views, I knew I needed at least a year to watch them go through this process, and in some ways kind of grow from the grief. That surprised me the most in the writing of it, that this was a story that was in many ways, because of the grief, because of the loss of the patriarch, it made room for the women in a way that they hadn't had room for before, right? And in the small business, in the succession of the small business, which in my experience usually is passed on to the male heir in the family, and suddenly we don't have a male heir, right? So we have 4 daughters that have to sort out succession. So I wanted to complicate that story and make it as realistic as possible. So I'm glad you saw that, Pat.
speaking of the family business, there are, do you have a history with pest control that you were able to draw from, that has been a family business in your life, or is that just research that you were doing into pest control because of some other reason?
Well, because it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the answer is both.
Okay.
I grew up in a family pest control business.
Mhm.
I wrote about it for Lit Hub recently, about my own family story. So you can read my story there,
Yeah.
and see how it sort of intersected with this, but how this is not in any way my family story. But I did grow up in a small family business, so I understand what it means to have a family business that is like another sibling at the table, right? You can't, there's no competing with them. And everybody has to devote their labor and all of their efforts to the family business for everyone to survive.
Yeah.
And so I was raised to labor in that way, but it's not really my family story. I have a bunch of brothers who still, my middle brother still runs the family business and works in it. And I'm out here teaching creative writing and writing novels. So I'm pretty far away from it, but I will
Right.
say that many of the things I learned in a family business have served me pretty well in publishing, and in the ability to wrestle and work really hard with a plot. So
Yes.
it's taught me a lot, but I'm a big fan of family businesses and of independent bookstores and all the ways in which this is very much an American story.
Yes. Yes. And that was one of the things, I mean, so that family business, while it is kind of this all-consuming aspect, we also, you know, the death of Robbie kind of also brings to light some of the things that had been hiding from everybody in the family, and just kind of what situation was the business was in.
Mhm.
And then, as you said, that, you know, setting the book in 2008 and being kind of right there in the middle of that recession time, which again, in 2021, it can feel sort of like a long time ago and not that long ago. And it kind of depends on where you were probably in your life in 2008 as to how well, as to what you remember from that. But it was, you know, this was a time when, and a business that had kind of been going along for a long time and a little bit resistant to change, a little bit resistant to the fact that the 21st century was here and things were going to be a little bit different. And you said it earlier, yearning for a past that was based in fear, but also may not have ever really existed in the first place. And I think that that was one of the things that really came through a lot for me in the book as well, is that they were scared of a future that seemed completely different. The parents mostly were scared of a future that seemed completely different from anything they knew, and yearned for a past that was not accurate to what the past really had been. And I think that that's something that, you know, it was not pandering to a rural audience. This is just a reality about the changes in America right now and in rural communities that you see it in. You certainly see it every 4 years in voting, and they're talking about you know, the way that these states are changing their electoral math. But there were just a lot of those little touches that were capturing kind of that small town experience that felt very real and earned.
It seems timely also, I think, in 2021 to have gone, you know, to be hopefully at the closer end to a pandemic, in the way that the pandemic has brought up this uncertainty in small businesses also, right? So I was raised in a small family business. Businesses are, without a doubt, they're the backbone of this country. And you know, the pandemic created a lot of uncertainty, the same way that the recession did in 2008 also. 70% of businesses at the beginning of the pandemic last March had to actually shut down in a similar way as they struggled in the recession. So I think the story of the Fellers has become actually even more timely, right? And so I knew that it was going to be a useful read for a politically divided country. I couldn't have predicted that we would be exactly where we are today for the read to be quite so timely, but I hope it's a story that can give access to those worlds, right? If you're not familiar with a family business, if you haven't been raised in a family business, but you are, I promise, touched by an independent business, by a small family business, probably in many ways. And so I accidentally wrote a very timely story. But it wasn't, I think that writers sometimes have their ears to the ground and get rumblings from what's happening in our country, from what's happening in the world around us long before, and they hit the page long before it actually happens. We are trained to pay attention. And so to see and feel what's happening in our country very much made sense to me when I was writing this. But there were a lot of surprises along the way too.
Sure, I'm sure. I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between the four sisters and how it worked for you writing them. I'm always curious when I read books that are coming from narrators, from multiple narrators. In that process, when you would sit down, were there days that you could not get the voice from one of the sisters or from Grace, that you wanted to write Maggie, but she just wasn't there, or does it not work that way? Were you able to just kind of, you knew what story you needed to tell and where you were gonna, it still moves in a linear fashion, even though we're switching around the narrators. We're not kind of going back a whole lot to recapture from a different point of view.
Yeah, this is a great question, Pat, about writing process, and I will tell you about putting the Hive together, and then I wanna preempt it though with I do not recommend this process, which is writing, five third person point of views really requires writing almost five different novels, and then figuring out how to weave them really back together. And so I knew that I had a 12-month calendar. I knew that it was going to be linear, right? It had to be
Mhm.
sequential. I wouldn't be able to keep track of that many narrators if we were moving back and forth the time. There are certainly flashbacks, especially to Robbie, because he has so little agency actually in the story as a point of view character. I never wrote his point of view. It is not Robbie's story to tell. But in writing the five sisters, writing the four sisters and the mom, I often wrote a scene or a plot point from multiple point of views to try to figure out whose story it was at that moment to tell and who had the most access. So the funeral scene, for example, I knew had to be Tammy's because of her ability to, uh, as a great character, create drama, stir up drama, but see all the drama that was unfolding also and be such a keen observer. So I wrote it from different point of views and then figured out that is the scene that has to be from this point of view. And I did that multiple times in the drafting. So then once I figured out the time, the plot, the characters, I pulled each of the five point of views out and I rewrote each of those from start to finish. And that helped me stay for a month in each point of view to get that voice clear. I mean, the narrator is consistent throughout. The narrator really is the one that holds the story together. And you hear the narrative voice with the four sisters on the dock at the beginning and at the end of the story. But the four sisters don't, we're not in any of their point of views. We're only in the narrator's point of view. So there were these touchstones at the beginning and the end of the book, and really five different novels throughout that I was weaving together to try to get this voice, this larger voice of the Hive together. So it was a difficult process. I do not recommend it, but I think it worked.
Yes, 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 I think so too. Uh, and so the I thought that it was interesting that there were times and I knew who each of these sisters were as I was reading the book, and I thought that you did a really nice job early on of giving us enough of each character to really kind of understand who they all were.
Mhm.
And at the same time, I felt like whether it was due to birth order similarities or the just kind of like an outlook on the world similarities, there were definitely sisters that I understood that standpoint a little bit better, and sisters that, I mean, the younger sisters were harder for me to kind of get
Mhm.
around their experience, especially Tammy. Tammy was actually the hardest character for me to, but she's also going through things that I never went through, lived experience 180 degrees probably from my own, and so it was a little bit different that way. But I just thought that it was really, you gave a voice to all of them, and you really gave a voice to Grace, the mother, um, as a character who, depending on, I suppose, the point of view of the reader, but
Mhm.
from my standpoint, hard to like probably early
Mhm.
on. And not because, just from like a holistic approach, not any one thing, but just kind of like a person that I don't necessarily see a lot of similarities with
Mhm.
from my own life. And um but her growth throughout the book was remarkable and wonderful.
It's hard. It's a coming of age story for each of them, right? And so, as you mentioned, Tammy and Kate are growing up on the page with their father's sudden death and the family business struggling, and yet they have all of their own hopes and desires too.
Mhm.
And Jules is away at college as a first gen student, and she's discovering herself. She's wrestling a great deal with her own political future and her first love, and Maggie's trying to hold it all together. Everyone is struggling, but I appreciate what you said about Grace because I really enjoy writing um, mothers that are a bit ambivalent. I don't see that as much in literature as I want to, but
Yeah.
it makes a lot of sense to me that there's not just one way to be a mother. Grace really believes that to save her family, the most important thing she could possibly do is prepare for the apocalypse or prepare for whatever threats are facing their future. And these are real threats, right? She's worried about climate change. She's worried about the, in EMP. She's worried about real things that are actually more mainstream in 2021 than they were even when I was writing this book.
Yes.
But I agree with you, Pat. She was a difficult character for me to have access to. And in fact, I did a lot of research to try to understand what motivated Grace. I think that's the job of a writer is figuring out how to have empathy for your characters, and if you don't, you shouldn't be writing them, and also how to put yourself in those shoes so that you can describe their point of view in a way that readers who may not have any experience, with prepper camp or with preparing for an apocalypse or being a survivalist might have some kindness toward them, right? That is definitely how Grace believes that she can best serve the Hive, is by saving them, is preparing. So I did a lot of research for Grace and asked a lot of really hard questions. I went to prepper camp, which is a real thing. Even as a fiction writer, I cannot make that up. It's a 3-day wilderness skill building workshop. It's in North Carolina. And I went there trying to figure out what that line was between preparedness, which very mainstream in 2021. We all just live through shortages. We're still living through them. And what does that mean? And where is the line between preparedness and kind of paranoia? When do you step over it? And that's what I was trying to figure out with Grace. And I was surprised to find survivalists, people with real skills. And I learned about beekeeping and composting and solar energy, values that seem a little bit more liberal in a conservative environment. So I was also very interested in the way that the values led the discussion rather than the politics. And so Grace was a surprise to me. She was a challenge to me. I still have questions about Grace, but I'm rooting for her. And she does, as you said, Pat, she, I think, changes the most throughout the novel.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it was early in the book. It is kind of easy to paint her with a broad brush, because you may have, I was coming into it with a idea of kind of the conspiracy side, and that you're worried about something. And because the book is set in 2008, and that at least 13 years on, she didn't need the pantry full of things that were going to expire and be eating these MREs, that that it has worked out longer than maybe she expected it to, or whatever it might be. But then, I think that I think there were some redeeming events that happened for her, and I'm not going to spoil anything for those that have not read it yet, but I do think that there are some redeeming qualities that come in. And also, like you said, she is expressing her love through making sure that her daughters are prepared for an emergency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's her love language. Tracking the weather every day to make sure that they know if there's a storm coming, making sure their cars are packed, making sure that they have, she's doing a lot of emotional labor that mothers often do, to think ahead to what could possibly hurt my daughters, right?
Right.
So Grace is trapped in that, I think, in many ways, because she was such a young mother. And her entire identity has been formed by being a mother, by being a member of the family business, and not being able to have her own say. And part of, I think, this preparedness and this apocalyptic prepping is her way of kind of controlling and facing her own fears. But she has to learn, like we all do, that if you've got to trying to save the hive, you got to fix yourself first. And so that's part of her journey throughout the book too. And I do have a lot of empathy for Grace in the end. It's a complicated grief that she has to sort, but she does genuinely make decisions that she absolutely believes will save her family.
Right. Mm-hmm. I wanted to talk about Robbie for just a minute, and the relationship with his daughters and the relationship with his wife, and I think that we see Robbie most in his relationship with his daughters. I think that they after he passes away, they all want him to be there to have to listen to them yell at him, basically. They want to be able to yell at you about this thing that you you messed this up for me, or this isn't going the way I wanted it to, and I want to be able to yell at you about it, and there's nobody else I really can, and it's not fair that you're not here anymore. And I think that that's that on the one hand, that's something that I think a lot of people can kind of relate to, that I want you here for this. And whether it was, maybe it was to yell at them, but maybe it was just, I want to share my joys with you also. But also, sometime coming into this book, if you're identifying a little bit more with the daughters than with the parents, as far as the political outlook, or just kind of that the change is on its way, we need to be thinking about this, that Robbie, in the end, really cared and loved his daughters, and his daughters loved him a great deal. And, he may have been kind of demeaning in public to them sometimes, or say the thing that we might think is the wrong thing. But ultimately, they loved him very much. And it was, this is a family that cared about each other a great deal.
They did. And I think their foundation is strong. And I think it's tested by his loss, by the family business's struggle, by their own future, and by each of them wanting and desiring different things. And so that has to have some place in the family business structure too. And boy, I really wanted to write a true grief story. And I wanted it to be a tale of not just survival, but also of thriving, which and the type of growth that comes from that grief. And I think it's realistic, and maybe not something we talk about as much, that there is anger in grief. There is a loss and a frustration with the person who leaves in a way. Yeah, each of these daughters has to go through that too, and reconcile their love for him with their frustration, with the mess he kind of left, and also the ways in which he won't be a part of their future, and that there's really a loss in that too. So I wanted it to be an accurate portrayal of grief, even if it's a tough one sometimes.
Yeah.
In my experience, that's how grief is.
Yes. And especially with the death being so immediate. A heart attack comes out of the blue for a relatively young man, man in his early 40s, that wasn't healthy necessarily, and had some health issues in the past, but certainly was not the daughters and Grace did not see this coming. His employees did not see this coming, but also the community that had been supportive, or maybe not as supportive as he led his family to believe, we're not expecting this either. And that was a real, I felt like that the reaction of the community, where this is a family business that's been in Cape Girardeau for 4 generations. So we're talking about 80 years of serving that community, well known. They were part of a church, they were part of a school community, they have multiple daughters. And so this is a town where you'd start to feel like pretty much everybody, and everybody knows you. And there was a lot of empty words and not a lot of help coming for the daughters in the wake of their dad's demise.
Yeah, I don't know that we're really good at expressing our grief.
Yeah.
And that sudden type of grief. Have you read Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking?
I've read other Didion, but I have not read that one.
Everything she writes is genius, but I would highly recommend, if readers are interested in this topic. The Year of Magical Thinking was a huge inspiration for sudden grief and all the different processes that a family goes through. And the range of emotions, right? I think we tend to limit ourselves. We're going to feel sorry and sad that someone died, and then that's it. But it's always more complicated than that. And I think the way that the community responds is more complicated than that. And the fact that the community is now uncertain because they too have doubts about the women being capable, as Robbie did too, of actually leading this family business. And they see the struggles, but they assume it's because the women are in charge. And part of what they don't want to reveal is the way that Robbie's pride as a man, as a person who was trying to take care of his family in the way that he knew how also, was complicated and left a lot of surprises for them to discover afterwards, without getting any too much away, Pat. I think that Robbie's pride in his health and his pride in not facing reality was also a way of trying to protect them too, but it ends up hurting them a great deal.
Yes.
Mm.
Melissa, I noticed your necklace is that a bee or is it a butterfly? I can't.
No, this one's a bee. One of my
Oh, it's a
daughters.
bee. Yeah,
Yeah, one of my daughters gave it to me for Mother's Day. I'm getting a lot of bee themed
I bet.
related gifts these days, and it's been a lot of fun. I couldn't have picked a better. I don't know if a book has a theme, but sort
Yeah,
of a symbolism. It
right.
seems that bees are everywhere right now. So I promise you, I did not plan that, but I'm certainly enjoying it. So yes, I
That's
do have
excellent.
a bee necklace.
Well, that's great. That's great. Great job for the daughter. Great Mother's Day gift.
Thank you.
That was well done.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, the beekeeping aspects of the book. I mean, it was interesting. It was interesting to me, kind of the journey that the hives needed to take to be able to be moved. That it was not something that you could do in kind of one moment. And I really liked, that was the way that sort of. I mean, that's the way that it is for us too. We can't
Mhm.
move all the way kind of in one thing and expect to be able to get there, and you have to prepare yourself for it. And I think that Robbie's death kind of came out of the blue, and they needed that time that, for the rest of the book to be able to move themselves into that place where they were going to be able to know what comes next, and working through that, those months together, and also apart. The sisters don't always rely on each other when they can, and I think that was very true too. But I really liked how, I did not know that about bees, that
Mm.
kind of move them incrementally, or else they're going to get lost and
Mhm.
find their way back.
Yeah, it's a great metaphor for grief as well. Bees are absolutely brilliant and we need them so much. And that was part of what growing up in a family pest control business I saw as well. We did a lot of live trapping and relocation of animals that didn't need to be hurt, but that seemed a pest. And bees were always a part of that. And so but they're a food source. They are a pollinator. We absolutely need them to be in harmony, and we need them to communicate. And there's such a great metaphor for a family, but um, there's also a loss in the hive that affects every member of the hive. I think that's part of the reason some of these minor characters become so interesting in the book too. Brian, the cousin, who is a part of the family business, actually ends up being simply a member of the business that wants to participate in it, right? He wants to benefit from the hive, and he doesn't in any way want to dominate it. He's in many ways kind of a worker bee. So his story makes sense to me too, but hives are such great, rich metaphors. There's so much we can learn from the ways that bees actually operate, and in the ways that we need them. It doesn't actually make sense to try to kill them with chemicals when we end up harming ourselves actually more.
Right. And Brian was a really interesting character for me. We never are getting his perspective. He's always, in conversation with one of the sisters, or with Grace. But the way, you can make some assumptions about who Robbie is, and that he would not be very accommodating or welcoming to someone who is Brian, an academic, somebody who's more interested in books than shovels, and that sort of thing. But Brian has this great relationship with Robbie, and really Robbie's outlook on life, was that, each person can kind of do their own thing, and what is good for me is not really what anybody else needs to do. I'm not trying to make you do it the way I do it, but um, especially the people he cared about and the people he knew in his life. And so you can pretty easily make some assumptions about a person, you know, like these characters, and then they were able to surprise you as a reader.
Right.
That was
It's
wonderful.
always, yeah, it's always complicated when we decide one person is one way or a person of this political persuasion feels this way. It's always really dangerous territory. We're usually wrong. And so I very much wanted Robbie to be a character that even in his death continues to surprise you. And for Brian to be sort of the anti-Robbie, even though they loved each other so much. In many ways, Robbie's the one who gives Brian permission to be the man in the way that he wants to be. And to follow what he loves to do, because there is this rugged individualism, right, in Robbie. And we see the dark side of that in the novel as well. But we also see that when, a character like Jules applies that individualism to her own body, it becomes complicated in the family. And she's just taking the values that she was raised with, taking care of herself and being self-sustaining and having freedoms and rights. And then she's applying it, and suddenly it doesn't quite hold up in the way that the family's political system. But I wanted those conversations to happen with a family that might give us as readers access to a conversation that we need to have around our own dinner tables, but that is complicated to have. Maybe it's easier to have those conversations with fictional characters, right? Than with our own personal stories around our dinner table. So that is intended to be my gift for the reader. They can talk about these characters in a way that might seem safer than talking about their own political opinions.
That's right. That's right. Well, it's a book that lends itself very well to book club discussion and family discussion, and something that you want to, a book that you want to talk about. One of my colleagues at the store has read it as well, and we've been enjoying talking about the book as as we're at different places in it. And so the other thing, you'd mentioned just that it doesn't fit in with their political beliefs. Jules's kind of expression of these values doesn't necessarily align with her parents politically. But I felt like the book was a fair representation. And sometimes it can be, you can read things written by somebody who doesn't really know that space and other side necessarily. And I thought that you did a really wonderful job of kind of incorporating both sides, and people who have some knowledge of the Midwest or of these smaller communities. I don't think it has to be Midwestern necessarily, but small communities where there's a generation that is yearning for something that they think is gone, and a younger generation that really, even if they don't want to vote for a liberal candidate, they understand the need for change and the need for growth and the need for moving forward. And I thought that was just so beautifully represented in the
I appreciate that very much. That was definitely one of my goals, but that's a difficult thing in our polarized country to pull off. And I feel like I'm in a unique position because I can traffic class, because I'm from a community that has that type of rural urban divide. And it does seem to me more than just a Midwestern or a rural, it seems more of a rural urban divide. And yet I live, near Washington, D.C. and I have learned that people can be as worldly on a dirt road in Missouri as they can be isolated in a suburb of Washington, D.C. Like, it's a matter of how people respond to differences, and a matter of how they respond with curiosity rather than fear. And so I'm not sure it's quite as clear as we want to think it is, but it's also a matter of exposure, right? I've moved all over this country. And so to have the type of exposure and really curiosity about the ways that people disagree, in some ways it makes me feel sometimes uncertain, but I think it also gives me a lot of fuel as a writer to be able to perhaps be able to bridge that political divide in fiction. I hope, anyway. That's my goal.
Yeah. Well, and I think that there are places in the country that it is in a lot of places in the country where it's very easy to surround yourself with people who look the same as you, think the same as you, have more or less the same experience as you, and that's true in Cape Girardeau. That's also true in the suburbs of DC. That's also true in Tulsa. That's also true in Seattle, Washington. That if you want that experience, it's there. That's the default. That's the easy. That stretching beyond that is going to take a little bit of effort on your part. And even when you think that you're doing the things that are supposed to stretch you beyond that, it sometimes doesn't wind up. You still wind up in the same echo chamber that you were in before. And so
I think we all have those blind spots, right? I think being aware of those blind spots can help all of us, but also seeking out the things that are that we don't understand yet, right? And being curious about them rather than defensive about them. I think that's what fuels a writer. Is I absolutely have questions, and I'm still asking so many questions, and I'm really driven by the things I don't yet understand. And so I always begin novels with questions too. And I kind of try to write my way toward them.
Right. That's wonderful. Well, I wanted to also ask our audience if they have any questions for Melissa, and to post those in the Q&A. And we do have a little bit of time that we can get to some questions from the audience if there are any. So please post those in the Q&A. My last thing that I wanted to make sure that I talked about, Melissa, was just, with this last year of kind of being at home, has there been anything that you're really excited about reading, or is there anything coming out soon that you are really excited about from kind of other authors that you decided to read or that you have read and are really excited about?
I have so many. I have so many book recs, and I am absolutely positive that these are all books that you carry too. So it is important that the audience and anyone watching actually gets these books locally from your bookstore. You all ship anywhere, right?
That's right. That's right.
Amazing. I do. I have so many books I want to recommend. What would you like book recs in? Fiction, poetry? What are we doing?
Do it all. I mean, just start at the top of the stack. We'll just go from there.
This may be one of my favorite books from last year. It's called Tomboyland. It's by Melissa Scholes, also a Midwesterner, but really writing about the cultural divide also, but it's a collection of essays that is just absolutely stunning. This is a book I haven't finished yet, but I cannot put down. It's a memoir. Have you seen this one, Pat? Yeah. It just came out, Ashley Ford. Yes. This is this is a collection of essays also I'm reading by Lauren Huff.
We're doing an event with Lauren Huff on July 5th. So after the 4th of July, we're going to be doing an event with Lauren, virtual event, 7:00 on Zoom. So
I'm so happy to hear that. I really admire these essays. They are brave. They are very, very brave. This is a short story collection that I absolutely love. It came out last year by Amber Sparks, but still incredibly relevant. Filthy Animals by Brandon Taylor. You've all probably at least heard of. That comes out next week, and I'm interviewing him for Fiction Writers Review. This is a book that I absolutely think is in conversation. Milltown by Carrie Arsenal came out last year. She just won the main book prize for it. And I think it's very much in conversation with the Hive, talking about rural communities and the ways in which sometimes when the business in the community has to change, that the community needs hospice rather than blame. And I find that to be rare in the way that we actually talk about our changing communities. I have so many recommendations. Have you read poetry? Have you read Made to Explode by Sandra Beasley? That's one of my absolute favorite poetry collections from last year.
No, that's okay.
I've got piles of books, Pat. You shouldn't ask for recommendations.
Yeah.
Right. Writers are readers.
That's right. That's right. I am excited. I'm getting ready to start Raymond Antrobus's and he actually just recently moved to Oklahoma, like recently in the last year or so. And his first collection, The Perseverance, is out now, and then he's got another collection coming this fall that is going to publish simultaneously in the UK and in the US, and so I'm really excited about that. And
it's a collection of short stories?
It's a poetry collection.
Oh, poetry collection. Awesome.
Poetry collection. Oh, and he has a picture book that is also just wonderful called Can Bears Ski, about a boy hearing difficulties and his dad, and I mean they're bears, and it's a cute book and good for everyone.
It sounds like a lovely book to gift.
Yes. And
luckily we can get that at Magic City as well, right?
That's right. That's right. That's right. Yes, you can. Yes, you can. And if it's not, so we have a partnership with Bookshop, like independent bookstores, and then we also have some of our collection available through our Square Store website, including tonight's book, The Hive, and a link to purchase that is in the chat. We also, you can give us a call at the store, and whatever we have on the shelf or can order, we can send out to you as well.
And that's something you can only do through small independent bookstores, right? Yeah, that's right. Just to call them on the phone and say, can you ship this to me? Yes.
That's right. That's right. Melissa, we do have a question here from Kate. Kate says, with 5 different perspectives, how did you structure your writing of this book? Did you write for certain characters first and others later? Talk more about how you chose which characters should narrate certain chapters. Also, one more, who was the hardest character to write?
Those are great questions, very writerly questions from Kate. I would expect nothing less. So I had to write, as I did with my first novel, I write a lot, I guess, wrong in order to figure out what actually works. My first novel, I wrote an entire point of view, 200 pages that didn't make it into the final draft. And I know that devastates new writers to find out that there are so many hundreds of pages that don't make it into the final draft. But for me, in my process, that's what it requires. So I often had to write a scene from at least 3 different point of views to figure out who was the right point of view character for it, right? Who had the most access to it, who was the most interesting, and who it actually affected the most, whatever the event was. So I had to also rewrite each point of view character from start to finish to have consistency and voice. And that was a hard thing to do. It is very much like writing, as I said earlier, 5 different novels. And that had its own challenges, but also its own rewards. It was a much more ambitious story to write it that way, and much more complicated. And I think it told, we have the narrator, we have each 5 point of views, but then we also have sort of an overarching voice of the hive. And I don't think I could have gotten that kind of chorus of all of them together if I hadn't written it from different point of views. And also from third person point of views. So we have some narrative distance as well, rather than all of them being first person. I never even tried to write them as first person. It just didn't, I needed that narrative voice to kind of hold it all together. That's a great question about which one was the hardest. Maggie was the hardest for me to write, the older sister. She was the hardest for me to write because she has so many blind spots, but also so much goodwill toward the family. And her one singular goal is to save this family business and to make a place for herself in it, and to just persevere regardless of what she perceived as her father's judgments about her limitations, which may or may not be true, right? It's complicated with parents. And I don't think for a second that Robbie wasn't proud or didn't have faith in Maggie, but she herself didn't actually feel it. She had to figure it out for herself. So she was a character that I struggled with the most. Maybe it's my own personal blind spot because I was raised in a family business, but have all these brothers. So I was never considered and didn't have a natural desire to be a part of the family business. So maybe that character stretched me the most, actually. Then there were other characters that were just a hoot to write. I think Tammy is really fun. And Kate is very dear because she's going through this enormous grief with her father, but also at the same time figuring out her own, she's coming of age, and there's really complicated feelings that she feels about the world around her too, that were kind of a privilege to watch emerge and to see how the family dealt with those two. So it was fun to watch the sisters know things about each other that maybe they didn't know about themselves, which I think happens a great deal in families. But then also sometimes to be wrong about each other, because everybody is a dynamic character. Even within a year of grief, everyone is changing. But then they also have these, familiar patterns, as we all do when we go home to our families. You sort of step back into those roles of the way you were before and become someone that's sometimes unrecognizable because you've changed so much. But the family isn't built to recognize that change. I don't know if you experience that too, Pat.
Yes.
You go home again.
Yes. Well, and whether it's the addition of somebody new that kind of throws it off, or the loss of someone that can throw it off, but there is a, whether it, when my family is small, and it was really just 4 of us for a long time as adults, and I didn't grow up with any cousins or extended family in that way. And so we just, there were some grandparents that were there in childhood and that sort of thing. But we really did. I mean, you kind of knew who each other was. And it got to the point where you had this idea about who somebody was, and then they did something that surprised you of the family, and you're like, well, that's not, and you realize, no, in our family they are that one, but in the world they're not that that have leadership abilities, and they are capable of other things than just than the role they play in this family. And
families as they all shift. I grew up in a huge family, 27 first cousins, dozens of aunts and uncles. There was always family around. So there was the family kind of point of view and the way the family operated. And then there were all these individuals within it. And I would argue that unless a family supports all of those individuals within it, it's not really working, right? If everybody can't feel safe to agree or disagree within the family, but everybody's always recalibrating and always being affected, as you said, by a new family member coming in or someone changing within the family structure. And I think that strong families can survive that, right? That they're not so threatened by one way of recalibrating or one change that might happen. It stretches all of us. I think it makes us all better. I hope.
I hope so.
It certainly makes the Fehler family better to have gone
Yes.
through this. Yeah, there's things that they discover about each other and ways in which they grow from the grief that may not have happened if this hadn't happened to their family.
Right.
And that's complicated. I always want to write complicated stories that people see themselves in.
Well, speaking of writing complicated stories, are you working on anything now that, I mean, this is in the world and I know it just came out a week ago. Sometimes isn't fair, but is there any projects that you're working on right now?
I'm always working on projects. And it's true. I mean, to bring a book out is an enormous effort. It's a team effort. I have an amazing team I have a publicist that's amazing and my publishing team that's amazing. But I'm always writing, truly. And I'm working on a collection, I think I'm calling Dispatches from the Working Class, and it's narrative nonfiction. I've published 2 novels, 2 chapbooks, and I edit an anthology of fiction as well. But I'm a nonfiction writer. And so I've been writing a lot of stories that I've recently published with Brevity and with LitHub. And I have another essay coming out soon. But the Working Class Dispatches are about feminist working class coming of age, middle America. And I'm excited about it. I'm really excited to be back in the writing desk and to wrestle with truth in a different way. I'm always working on another novel. I have a 3rd novel in the works as well.
Okay. Well, I'm looking forward to whatever comes next, whichever one gets published first. I'll be there. Thank you so much, Melissa. Pick up a copy of The Hive. Link is in the chat. We also, of course, you can stop by and see us at Big City Books if you're in Tulsa. Melissa, hopefully one day you will be able to join us for an in-person event and we can do this again.
I would be absolutely honored. I think it would be a lot of fun. I'm such a big fan of Magic City. So I wish you all success. Congratulations on your anniversary as well.
Thank you very much. We'll see you all again soon. Thank you for
joining. Bye, everyone. Thank you.